The Nvidia app keeps getting better and better to the point where it now has a ton of configuration options. But what configuration is best? What settings are worth changing to get the best experience on PC? Well, we've been testing GeForce graphics cards for a long time now. We've tested a lot of what the app has to offer. So we think there's a range of settings that you should be using on a daily basis. Now, this guide is not necessarily intended for hardcore PC gaming enthusiasts who are super familiar with the Nvidia app and have explored every setting it contains. But if you want to learn more about the app's features, you want to see the configuration we'd recommend, or you just aren't overly familiar with this software tool, hopefully you'll learn a few useful things from this video. These days, the Nvidia app is installed by default along with GeForce Game Ready drivers. Once installed, it's accessed through the Windows system tray. On first launch, you'll get some initial setup options. For gamers, we recommend the Game Ready driver update branch, then you're greeted with a toggle to optimize games. This applies Nvidia's chosen graphics settings to the games in your library, so if you like to tweak in-game settings yourself, we'd recommend disabling this option. Nvidia's optimizations can also be a bit weird at times, recommending high levels of frame generation and upscaling that aren't always necessary. So in general, this is a setting we don't recommend using unless you want the most basic experience possible. We recommend enabling the Nvidia Overlay because it's genuinely useful, and I'll show you some great options in there later. Signing in is optional, and then we can head straight into the app.
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duranaut High Performance Thermal Paste. Duranaut offers extreme long-term stability combined with outstanding thermal conductivity, and this has been achieved through a specially engineered silicon oil combined with aluminium microparticles and zinc oxide nanoparticles of various shapes. Duranaut isn't electrically conductive and won't harden over time. For best performance, you'll want to apply a very thin layer, and to help with this, included is the TG Spatula Pro. The spatula's revised design allows for increased pressure during application, making it easy to spread a thin, even layer of Duranaut. So for more information, please check the link in the video description.
First, I think it's a great idea to configure your display to get the optimal gaming experience. The Nvidia app includes some additional settings that aren't present in Windows that are important to enable while gaming, but I do want to also remind you that often when plugging in a monitor for the first time, your PC will not default to using the highest refresh rate your monitor supports. To get the highest refresh rate that you actually paid for, go into the Windows settings menu, head to System, Display, Advanced Display, then make sure the refresh rate is set to the highest supported value. Avoid the refresh rates with an asterisk next to them, as they will change the monitor to a non-native resolution. Experienced PC gamers will probably think this is a super obvious recommendation, but when I made a video a while back on how to set up your gaming monitor over on Monitors Unboxed, this was one of the key tips that generated a lot of positive feedback. You'd be shocked how many people were sent that video by a friend and left a comment saying they didn't know their system would not default to the highest refresh rate. I genuinely think this is the origin of many comments where people claim they can't see the difference between 60Hz and 144Hz. They bought a new 144Hz monitor and simply aren't using it at 144Hz because it's not default behavior. There is also a way to change the refresh rate in the Nvidia app, but it's a little convoluted as Nvidia split resolutions and refresh rates into PC resolutions and Ultra HD, HD, SD resolutions. Windows 11's settings menu does a better job of aggregating everything into one, making it clearer what the maximum capabilities of your monitor are, which is why I recommend setting the refresh rate in the Windows settings menu. But there are important display settings in the Nvidia app. These are accessed under System Displays. The first thing we want to adjust is enabling G-Sync variable refresh rates, regardless of whether you have a G-Sync monitor or not. This can be done by setting G-Sync to On under the G-Sync and Surround tab, then scrolling down to Display Properties and ensuring Allow G-Sync settings for the selected variable refresh rate display is also set to On. Both of these settings will be enabled by default if you have a G-Sync or G-Sync compatible monitor, but enabling them manually can also get G-Sync variable refresh to work on other monitors. You'll probably have noticed that in the first G-Sync settings menu, there was a choice to enable G-Sync for either full screen or full screen and windowed applications. In 2026, I recommend leaving this on just the full screen option, as this allows G-Sync to work with the vast majority of modern games, regardless of whether they are in borderless windowed mode, full screen mode, or exclusive full screen mode. The full screen and windowed option is a legacy tool that can extend variable refresh support to other games, typically older games, that don't work with the default full screen option. However, using this setting may also trigger variable refresh rates in desktop apps, which isn't a great experience as it can lead to a low display refresh rate, so we recommend just full screen for most people. The Nvidia app also has a variety of display color settings. I recommend leaving all the color channel settings at their default values, which gives you the best color accuracy, and I also recommend leaving the override to reference mode setting disabled. In this configuration, the color accuracy mode should say accurate, which is the best way to use your monitor as this allows color profiles to work properly for the best accuracy. The other color settings at the top might be useful to change though. By default, Nvidia typically uses an 8-bit output even if your monitor supports 10-bit. This can be changed by switching the mode from default to Nvidia, then changing the output color depth to 10-bit. Only do this if the output color format remains as RGB. This is an indication that there's enough bandwidth to support 10-bit without reducing color quality. If the output color format setting changes to YCB-CR422 or 420 when increasing the color depth to 10-bit, you should reduce the color depth back to 8-bit. Using 10-bit color instead of 8-bit can reduce color banding in some situations, especially in games or applications that use a high bit depth and when your monitor natively supports 10-bit output. This is something I especially recommend on OLED and true HDR monitors. Output dynamic range is not a setting most people will need to adjust. However, on some displays, this setting will need to be set correctly to avoid raised or crushed blacks. This is typically only necessary in my experience when hooking up an Nvidia GPU to a display over HDMI. If you're using a gaming monitor or capture card over HDMI, the correct setting is usually full. If you're using a TV over HDMI, the correct setting is probably limited, but possibly full, and it might not even matter on your certain TV model. You can check whether this setting is set correctly through the Lagom black level test. If it's correct, the background of this test will be black, and each dark square will be distinct and visible. If you're using the limited mode, but the correct setting is actually full, your screen will look washed out. The background of the test won't be black. This is fixed by setting it to full instead. If you're using full, but the correct mode is limited, this black level test will have severe black crush, where most of the first 3 rows look identical. This is fixed setting it to limited. Next, I'm going to focus on the graphics menu, where we can control some of the features that apply directly in games. The Program Setting tab gives you control on a per game basis, while Global will change settings for all games. For modern games that support it, it's worth using Nvidia's DLSS override feature found in the driver settings of a specific game. I'll start with the Model Presets option. This allows you to upgrade the DLSS version used in games from older versions to newer versions, typically providing superior image quality. For example, in a game that natively supports DLSS 3.0, you can upgrade it to DLSS 4.0 or DLSS 4.5 using the DLSS override feature. The best way to use the Model Presets override is the Custom option, but the specific options to use for each feature are quite complex, so I'll try to simplify this as best as possible. Super Resolution has the most preset choices, ranging from A to L. So many options, which one to choose? Well, this depends on the generation of GeForce GPU you own and the level of performance you want to achieve. Newer GPUs are more flexible and can run any of these model preset options with a limited performance cost. Older GPUs can really struggle to run the newer models without a significant performance decrease. On RTX 40 and 50 series GPUs, the best setting in my opinion is preset L. I've tested the visual output extensively, comparing L to other presets, and in most games, it looks the best, with the least visual artifacts while upscaling. I recommend preset L in all DLSS upscaling modes, quality, balanced performance, and ultra performance, if you want the best visual quality. However, preset L is the most performance-intensive preset. It runs about 5% slower than preset M, which is a very similar but not quite as good model from the DLSS 4.5 family. It also runs about 10% slower than preset K, which is the previous model from the DLSS 4.0 family. If you want better performance while maintaining a good output quality, preset M and especially preset K are solid choices, especially at higher upscaling modes like DLSS quality. The image quality benefits of preset L are more significant using lower modes like performance and ultra performance, so in those configurations I'd recommend preset L regardless of the performance cost. On RTX 20 and 30 series GPUs, there is a much larger performance cost associated with using preset M or L. For this reason, you may not want to use these options. Even on the flagship RTX 3090, preset M can run 15 to 20% slower than preset K, so most of the time preset K is the optimal choice on 20 and 30 series GPUs. The best model preset options for the other features are more straightforward. Ray reconstruction doesn't give you preset options, so this should be set to recommended, which uses the newest model. Frame generation should be set to preset B where available, as this is the latest model from 2026 with better image quality and refined UI handling. Not all games support frame generation preset B, so if it's not available, that's why. The DLSS override frame generation mode option allows you to increase the amount of frame generation in games that may not support the latest multipliers. So for example, if you want to use 4x or 6x frame generation, but the game you're playing is a bit older so it only has an on-off toggle for frame gen, you can use the frame generation mode override to turn 2x frame gen into 4x or 6x frame gen. You'll also find dynamic frame generation in this part of the Nvidia app, which based on what I've seen requires a bit of refinement from Nvidia before I recommend using it, though you might like to experiment with it for now. There's also the DLSS override super resolution mode option. This is useful if you want to use DLSS for anti-aliasing at a native render resolution, aka using the DLAA mode, but the game doesn't support it. With this setting set to DLAA, it will override any DLSS setting used in that game, for example if you switch it to DLSS quality mode, and it will then use DLAA instead. DLAA is typically of a much higher quality than the standard TAA option found in most games, so it is something we would recommend. Overrides can be set on a global basis, so you don't have to change the setting every time for every game. That's a good set and forget configuration, especially if you like the image quality and performance of, say, DLSS upscaling preset L. I don't recommend doing this if you want to tweak the preset on a per game basis. There's a few other useful settings in here. If you want to use frame generation, but you don't want the frame rate to exceed your monitor's refresh rate and cause tearing, you can use driver settings to do this. The best way of achieving this is through forcing vertical sync on. Some games will force VSync to off when frame generation is enabled, but you can override that in the Nvidia app. The max frame rate setting is an alternate way to achieve this, as this is a basic frame rate limiter. Setting this option to slightly below your monitor's max refresh rate is optimal to prevent tearing and can also have some latency benefits. Next, I want to talk about the Nvidia Overlay, which is a useful in-game tool that allows you to see statistics, record gameplay, and apply filters. The default shortcut to bring up the overlay is Alt-Z. On the left, you'll see all the various features, such as to record gameplay. Hitting the play button or using the Alt F9 shortcut will start a recording immediately. If you're going to use the Nvidia Overlay to record gameplay, and it's a great tool for that, you might want to configure the recording settings to get the best quality. This can be done through the settings cog, then navigating to video capture. Here you'll find the options for recording resolution, frame rate, bitrate, and codec. Resolution should either be set to in-game or the same resolution as your monitor. Frame rate should usually be set to 60 FPS as that's the most shareable and usable format, but you can switch this to 30 or 120 FPS. Just be warned that while 120 FPS is obviously going to create smoother files for local playback, it's pointless for uploading to YouTube as the maximum supported frame rate on YouTube is 60 FPS, and it is a bit more performance intensive to record at 120 FPS instead of 60 FPS. Recording quality is determined by the quality option, which also sets the bitrate, and the codec option. H.264/HEVC are lower quality codecs, but are more widely supported and easier to play back. AV1 is a higher quality codec, so quality is better at smaller file sizes, but it's less supported. You can upload AV1 to YouTube, but you can't on all platforms, and I don't recommend AV1 if you're planning to edit the file because it's much slower to work with in video editing software. The bit rates Nvidia uses on the high quality option are generally pretty good in my experience, so that's what I'd recommend using. However, for really fast-paced action and where storage space or upload bandwidth isn't an issue, I just crank the bitrate to the maximum. The statistics overlay is also quite useful if you want to view in-game FPS and utilization measurements. It can be enabled in the overlay or via the Alt-R shortcut. If you go to the statistics option in the overlay, you'll see under statistics view that there are multiple variants of the overlay if you want to see more information. The DLSS view is particularly useful if you are using overrides, as this overlay will confirm whether the override is working and what presets are being used. When HDR is used, the overlay can be quite bright by default, often much brighter than the UI in the game. I find the default settings pretty harsh in the HDR mode, and it's also not great for OLEDs, which burn in faster at higher brightness outputs, and the overlay is largely static. There is no easy way to reduce the overlay brightness in the HDR mode, but it can be hacked a bit by changing its color. To do so, click Configure Heads-Up Display, then go to Font Color. Change this to Custom and then enter the custom color code of BBBBBB. This is my personal preference, you can change that of course, but this particular setting effectively keeps the overlay white but at a lower brightness level. Lastly, I want to touch on Nvidia's RTX HDR feature, which can be used with an HDR monitor to convert SDR games without an HDR implementation into HDR games. This is a better method of performing SDR to HDR conversions than Windows' built-in Auto HDR feature, and it's enabled in the System, Video, RTX Video Enhancements HDR section of the Nvidia app. When you turn it on, you'll see there's various settings you can change for peak brightness, contrast, and saturation. If you're planning on using RTX HDR, I'd recommend following this excellent settings guide from Reddit, which has detailed values depending on the peak brightness of your display and preferences for saturation and gamma. However, I generally don't recommend using RTX HDR for SDR to HDR conversions. In most PC games, the better way of doing this is to use a Reno DX mod if available. Reno DX is a reshade add-on framework that, through mods for individual games, directly injects an HDR pipeline to replace the SDR pipeline. This system does a much better and more accurate job of handling HDR than the RTX HDR post-processing filter, offering an experience that's more native. There are even Reno DX mods available for games with native HDR implementations that fix the HDR output in those games, which are well worth exploring. That's not to say RTX HDR is useless, because it's much easier to enable and broadly works across titles without needing to install mods for each game. It's good to be aware Reno DX exists though, because it's excellent. The Nvidia app does have other features like automatic tuning and mild overclocking capabilities, but the things I've covered in this video are more the essentials. These days, there are very few reasons to go back into the legacy Nvidia control panel to adjust things. The vast majority of important settings are now found within the Nvidia app, and there are settings the app has that the control panel does not have, like DLSS overrides. For this reason, we strongly recommend using the Nvidia app over the control panel. It's also just faster and has a nicer, easier to use interface in my opinion. But anyway, that's it for this guide to the Nvidia app. Hopefully you found this guide useful and found some settings that are worth changing or things that you didn't know about the Nvidia app before now. But yeah, there are quite a few interesting and useful settings in there that can really enhance your gaming experience. I especially like the DLSS override feature. Bumping that up to preset L does enhance a lot of games, so it's definitely something that is worth using. Anyway, if you do want to support Hardware Unboxed and the independent testing that we do, we have Patreon. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you get access to some cool benefits. We've got Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS content, and plenty of other good stuff. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.